It's very hard to understand the importance of proclaiming that Black Lives Matter if you don't understand American history. And particularly if you don't understand the American history of policing in communities of color. Because if you don't understand that history, then to proclaim and to demand that Black Lives Matter seems like something special. So folks trip out and they freak out. Oh, well, Black lives, well, all lives matter. Yes, sweetheart, they do. That is true and utterly irrelevant to the current moment. Of course, all lives matter. Nobody said otherwise. But you don't have to proclaim that which is taken for granted. You have to proclaim that which is ignored.
Now, to say racism does not exist in America is to be a liar, because we have seen many instances where racism has been projected publicly. But then, many times when whites are faced with these issues, one of the phrases that they are always ready to throw around is that I am not a racist. This does not really mean that they don't want those activities to continue, but it really shows their defense mechanism towards issues relating to racism. If racism is to end in America, how is it going to end? First of all, I think whites must first of all face and dismantle their privilege. They must work towards joining anti-racism that requires commitment to dismantling white supremacy within themselves, families, workplaces, communities, and culture. I think this is what is needed for anything to happen within the society. And because of this, many people always shy away from really speaking about issues of racism or how they affect Black people. Especially, rarely do whites talk about it. However, there are certain white people who have always come to the forefront to really face this issue and find solutions for the vices that affect Black people. One of the notable whites who has been very, very vocal on this issue is Tim Wise. I want to play for you this clip where he was giving a speech about Black Lives Matter and how his speech was very, very in-depth in issues relating to racism. Let's watch this, then come back and share our thoughts together.
See, when white people say all, we never meant it. Black people know that. Brown people know that. Most white people never had to really learn that. So we said all men are created equal, and we didn't mean that shit. You see? We said it, but we didn't mean it. We said it, and we wrote Black people and brown folks out of all. So when people of color hear, when Black and brown folks hear all lives matter, what they hear is the same thing they heard with all men are created equal, that it was a setup, that it was a lie that didn't include them. So if you want to actually make it clear that all lives matter, A, you got to act like all lives matter, and you got to really treat people like all lives matter, and B, you have to proclaim that the lives that you denigrated for centuries actually matter, because that is the part that gets left out. You see? So when we say all lives matter, just to put this in perspective, how ridiculous this comeback is, how absurd, how sophomoric, how nonsensical it is for us to respond to Black Lives Matter with all lives matter. Let's take it back to like 1971 when the title, when the phrase, when the statement on the street was what? Black is beautiful. That was the way that Black folks were trying to take back notions of beauty from a fashion industry, from a glamour industry that had basically defined beauty as white, right? And so Black folks were saying Black is beautiful, reclaiming their own beauty standards and norms. To say all lives matter in response to Black Lives Matter would be like getting in a time machine tonight, going back to 1971, hearing somebody say Black is beautiful and interrupting them so as to let them know, well, we're all beautiful in our own way. Yes, shut up, we know. Sort of misses the point. Be like going back to the early 80s, right, when the HIV/AIDS crisis hit. And in those first few years of the HIV/AIDS crisis, remember, we had a government that did nothing. President Reagan sat by and watched thousands of people die before he even uttered the term AIDS. He only said something because his buddy Rock Hudson from the movies died of it. And then he decided he would speak on it and begin to cut loose some research funds for it. But for the first couple of years, didn't want to say anything about it, right? And there were activist groups out in the street, right? ACT UP, Gay Men's Health Crisis, others out in the street demanding funding for AIDS research. And what they were in effect saying, even though they didn't use the term and even though we didn't have hashtags in those days, right? Ultimately what they were saying was people with AIDS lives matter. So to say all lives matter in response to Black Lives Matter would be like going back to one of those rallies in 1982, 1983, interrupting the rally for AIDS funding to remind everyone that, well, people die of pancreatic cancer too. Yes, sweetheart, and totally irrelevant to the current situation. You have to demand recognition of the thing that gets swept under the rug. That's Black life. That's brown life. That's people of color, you see, because we are a country built on the premise that Black lives didn't matter. And I know we don't want to hear that, but that's just truth. We're built on a society that said that Black lives didn't matter except insofar as they could provide cheap labor to enrich white people. That was how Black folks were viewed, as cheap labor, expendable labor. I should also point out, it is how indigenous people were viewed, as people who could be expendable and committed genocide against without hesitation. It was also the way that many Asian Americans were viewed when they were brought here from places like China to work on the Transcontinental Railroad, worked to death, didn't care if they died or not. It's the way that Latino folks were viewed when in the 1930s we expelled tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands actually, of Mexican Americans who were citizens of this country, and we sent them back to Mexico in spite of their citizenship to free up jobs for white men. You didn't learn that in high school history. Maybe you ought to ask your history teacher why. Because it's not contestable, it's not arguable, it's not like there's a rebuttal to what I just said. That happened. But we didn't learn about it because Black and brown lives historically have not mattered except insofar as they serve the interest of the dominant group. Now, we can either deal with that and be honest about it, or we can keep running from it and acting like it didn't happen. But if we don't talk about it, if we don't understand that history, it becomes very difficult, doesn't it, to understand the current moment. You can't understand the movement against police misconduct if you don't understand the history of policing in this country vis-a-vis people of color. See, Black and brown folks know this history because it's embedded on their DNA. It's embedded in their family stories. They've had to learn it as a way to stay alive. But those of us called white haven't had to learn any of this. So we don't have to know the fact that modern policing traces back to slave patrols. That's where it comes from. What was the slave patrol? It was the thing that rich white people created to take poor white people and have them control Black folks. Those of us who don't come from wealth might want to think about what that trick was. Right? Elites who owned other people telling the rest of us, some of us poor white folks who didn't own anybody, hey, you're still part of the team. You can go control these Black people for us. See, that was a trick that rich folks played on poor folks to make poor white folks think that they had more in common with rich white people than they did with Black people. Some shit doesn't change. That still happens today. That is still the way that we operate today. And if people don't understand that, it's because they don't understand how that system works. So take it back to like 20 years ago now, right? A little over 20 years ago, the OJ verdict. I know there have been a couple. I mean, the first one. The first O.J. Simpson verdict, right? This verdict when O.J. Simpson was accused of, tried for, and ultimately acquitted of double murder in 1995, right? And you remember there was a big divide racially in this country, right? Black folks, about 2 out of 3, said that they agreed with the verdict. The acquittal they believed was just, doesn't mean they thought he was innocent, by the way. I talked to a lot of Black folks at that time. They were like, oh, I think he did that shit. But y'all made the rules, and under the rules that you made about reasonable doubt, I think you did not meet your burden. So you made the rules, you live by the rules. 2/3 of white folks were like, oh my God, this is the most awful miscarriage of justice. I can't believe, how in the world does this happen? This is the system was great until like 2 minutes ago. And then OJ walked, and oh God, what the hell's going on in this country? Right? Major racial divide. But listen, you know what? That racial divide made sense. It made perfect sense. I don't think it was because white people were racist and unfeeling and uncaring. Hell, white folks had loved OJ for like 20 years, man. OJ was done with Black folks. Black folks were done with OJ. Like OJ had walked, like, I'm just being honest, like OJ was not a Black problem. Like OJ had walked away from Black people. Like he grew up in Hunters Point in San Francisco, went to USC right there in the hood in South Los Angeles, and said when he left USC, like he didn't ever want to go back. He never wanted to go. So he started making Naked Gun movies that like only white people saw, and then he was like running through the airports in those Hertz commercials selling rental cars to white people. Like white folks loved OJ. until he did something that reminded them of a stereotype they had about black men. Then it was like, oh, he's black people's problem again, right? But OJ, so 2/3 of white folks didn't like the verdict. 2/3 of black folks liked the verdict, believed it was just, and that made perfect sense because what happened, if you remember the case, and if you don't, let me just fill you in real quick. One of the reasons that there was any kind of reasonable doubt was because one of the chief investigators who found a disproportionate amount of the blood evidence was revealed to be an overt racist. Right? So when black folks hear that, when they hear that there's a cop who found the evidence implicating a black man in the murder of 2 white people who regularly uses the N-word in an overtly racist way, then somehow, like alarm bells go off in black heads. Right? And by the same token, white folks don't hear those alarm bells because we're like, well, that's the craziest thing I've ever heard. Planting evidence on people. Who does that? That's bizarre. That makes no sense at all. That doesn't happen. No, it doesn't happen to us. But it does happen to people of color. There's a long history of that. In fact, not only is there a long history, at the very moment that the O.J. Simpson trial was taking place, 1994, 1995, at that very moment, we come to find out a few years later, if you paid attention to the news out of Los Angeles, that in fact there were dozens of officers in the LAPD who were at that very moment engaged in a pattern of misconduct and abuse and planting evidence on suspects of color to sweeten the deal against them in various prosecutions. It became the Rampart scandal. You can look that up. It was one division of the LAPD. It was happening at the very same time as that trial. So when black folks said, we think evidence might have been planted, and white folks said, that's paranoid nonsense, in fact, it wasn't. It was rooted in a reality, in a recognition that that stuff happens. Doesn't mean that that's what happened in the OJ case. It doesn't mean that that evidence was planted, but it does mean that to wonder if that's possible, given the revelations about Mark Furman, the officer in that case, wasn't paranoid, it wasn't irrational, it was rooted in one's actual experience. And if you haven't had that experience, it's just as logical for you to think it makes no sense. Right? In other words, our attitudes about race come from our experiences with race. So if we don't see something and somebody else does, it's not because we're bad people and they're good people, or we're stupid and they're more intelligent. It's just you don't have to think about stuff, so you don't. That's what white privilege really is when it comes to race. It's about the privilege of having the ability to be stone cold ignorant to other people's truth, being oblivious to other people's truth. White privilege is the blue pill from the Matrix, is what it is. Right? If you ever saw the film The Matrix, and if you haven't, you should go see it, but just the first one, the other two suck. Like, the trilogy's awful, but the first one is damn good, right? Keanu Reeves plays Neo, and Lawrence Fishburne plays Morpheus, and there's this scene early on in the film where Morpheus offers Neo 2 pills. One is blue, one is red, right? And he says, you can take the blue pill, and the story ends, and you wake up, and you remain oblivious, and you don't have to know what's really going on. Just like most people in this society, they don't want to know what's happening. They don't really want to know. They'd rather die than know the truth. Or you can take the red pill, and I can offer you enlightenment, and I can take you down the rabbit hole, and I can show you just how far it goes. And Neo takes the red pill, and he starts to see, if you've seen the movie, right, starts to see all the stuff that's going on that he never knew about. That is how identity functions in this country. It's how white identity functions, male identity, straight identity, able-bodied identity, affluent rich folk identity. When you're a member of any dominant group, you have the luxury of being on the blue pill and not having to know the truth, right? If you're the target of a system of oppression, you got to take the red pill just to figure out what the hell is going on, just so you don't lose your mind, right? Just so you can make some sense of your world. But if you're the dominant group, you're like on a blue pill IV drip from the day you come out of your mama's womb. Right, you're walking around with this damn IV, you don't even know you got it there. And then people of color are like, hey, you see all this racism? And we're like, no, got the blue pill. I don't see nothing. Men, right, same thing, on the blue pill. I know that being men and on the blue pill means some different stuff. In the modern pharmaceutical era, that's pharmaceutical humor. You're welcome. Men don't have to know anything about sexism, patriarchy, rape culture if we don't want to know it. Those of us who are straight or cisgender, we don't have to know about straight supremacy, about homophobia, heterosexism, transphobia. maybe we do know something, but if so, it's only because we probably listened to someone who was the target and decided to believe them, right? So ultimately, we don't have to, though. We have the luxury of being oblivious, taking the blue pill. So we have to be clear about this, because people of color don't have that luxury. So they know what goes on right now with law enforcement. They know places like New York City, stop and frisk policies, right, that over the course of about a decade stopped, what, hundreds of thousands, a couple million, several million, 2.5 million people were stopped by the stop and frisk policies of the NYPD. About 90% of them were people of color, right? And of those who were stopped, less than 5% were even issued a ticket because they hadn't done anything. So it's not like they were being stopped for actual criminal activity. They were being stopped on suspicion, and the suspicions were not justified in 95% of the instances. In less than 2% of the stops were drugs found. In less than 0.2% were weapons found. But that was the rationale they gave. Oh, we're trying to get drugs and weapons off the street, but they weren't finding drugs and weapons. What they were doing was taking black folks' names and putting them in a database so they could keep eyes on them. That's what stop and frisk was, and people of color know it. In this country, we know from the CDC and other sources that drug use and drug dealing is equivalent between white folks, black folks, and Latinos, contrary to popular belief, which says that it's black and brown folks who have and use and sell drugs. It's actually equivalent across racial lines, but we know that people of color 5 times more often are going to be arrested for drug possession, particularly for weed, and incarcerated on a drug-related offense. People of color know that, and they know that law enforcement is who does that. So that's why there's a skepticism toward police. That's why we have to proclaim that Black Lives Matter, because everything in the system says they don't. Right? They know the data. Even if they don't know the data, they know the reality behind the data, that young black men are about 21 times more likely to be shot and killed by law enforcement than young white men. Right? 2 to 3 times more likely when unarmed and posing no immediate threat. People of color know this. Whether they've done the research and know the exact numbers, or they just know it from their own experience. They know it. They know that young black children like Tamir Rice get shot dead in a public park doing what white boys do in this country every day, play with toy guns. White boys play with toy guns every day, and they do not get dropped by police because those police view them as 20-year-old men, which is what happened in Cleveland, right? They didn't see him as a 12-year-old. They thought he was 20. Right? Because we have animalized black men and we've made them older than they really are in our imaginations. So this kid's playing with a toy gun, something that white people, and keep in mind, Ohio's an open carry state. Right? So if he really was a 20-year-old male, which is what they thought at the time, he had a right to have a real gun, not a toy gun, a real gun. They had no right to shoot him, no right to come up on him, no right to say boo to him in a state that says you can walk around with weapons. White folks will take their weapons any damn place. We walk into Walmart with our guns. We walk into Chipotle. Seriously, Google that shit. Google, about 1.5 years ago, white folks were like, I'm going to take my weapons to Chipotle. It was like some demonstration or something, like just to show we could. We're going to Chipotle with our AR-15s. Why you got to have an assault rifle at Chipotle? But you can't kill salmonella with the bullet. I know they ran out of carnitas that time, but damn, they'll get that back. You don't have to shoot them. Right? And white folks will walk into Walmart with the weapon, walk into Target with the weapon. Nobody does anything. Nobody shoots them. Cops don't roll up. John Crawford, on the other hand, in Ohio, also open carry state, right outside of Dayton, whatever it was, right? Picks up a weapon. It was an air gun, an air rifle. You're not going to kill anybody with an air rifle. And they sell those at the Target. He picks it up off the shelf, or the Walmart, whichever it was. I think it was Walmart, right? He picks it up off the shelf. He's walking around. He's just sort of swinging it. He might be thinking of buying it. He's talking on the phone to his girlfriend, right? Some white dude sees him, freaks out, calls the cops. Oh, black guy walking around with a weapon at the Walmart. Yeah, he calls it in. He's a black guy with an afro. Okay, first of all, it's twists. Let's get our black hair straight, please. Right. I mean, come on, white folks. You can just Google that shit. It's not that hard. Like, there's a difference between twist and an afro. And look, can we try to get it straight without touching black people's hair? Can we do that too? Can we do that? So you can just look that up. You don't have to touch it. You don't have to touch it. You don't have to touch it just because you got a black roommate. You never seen one before. Can you get that wet? Can you swim? That's why they have the internet. Look it up. Right? So he calls in John Crawford, black dude with an afro. First of all, think about that. First of all, it's the wrong hairstyle. They're going to get some totally different black dude shot on like aisle 4 of the Walmart. They're going to roll up, find the dude with the afro, and kill him. But no, they found John Crawford. They come in. You can watch the video yourself. They roll up. The guy rolls up, turns the corner, opens fire immediately on John Crawford, who was posing no threat to anybody, drops him. At first, it doesn't kill him. John Crawford's stunned, dazed, probably in shock, gets up off the ground to figure out why is somebody shooting at me, moves into the aisle without the weapon, which is now not really a weapon. Like I said, it's an air rifle, sitting on the ground, and they shoot him again 5 times and drop him and kill him. No indictments. No indictments. And that officer was, by the way, the only officer in the history of that suburban Dayton Police Department ever to kill someone. He's now killed 2. That was his second. Still on the force and not indicted by the district attorney locally. So that is why people of color have to proclaim, and why we as white folks should as well, that Black Lives Matter. Because as long as the system allows that, what we're saying every day is that they don't. And if you have a system that screams every day that those lives don't matter, it takes those of us who believe otherwise to suggest the opposite. But it's a privilege, isn't it, to be oblivious to history? It is. It's a privilege to be able to be ignorant and still be considered educated. Right? How does that happen? How is it that we can not know these things and still be considered competent? Right? How is it that we can be considered competent to do anything, to teach children, to be a physician, to be a social worker, to be a psychologist, right? To vote and not know these things? Sort of interesting, isn't it? Right? Because there are certain things we are expected to know. Whatever the dominant group thinks we need to know, that's what we have to know. Right? That's why people of color, they have to learn white literature, white theater, white poetry, white art. I know we don't call it that. That's sort of the point. When your stuff is the norm, you don't have to ever qualify it. You don't have to talk about where it came from. You don't have to call it white literature. It's just literature, theater, and poetry, and art. Right? People of color have to know all that stuff that white folks decided was important. We as white folks don't have to know anything we don't want to know. And we can still be deemed competent. We can still be deemed intelligent. We can still get a high school diploma. We can still get a college degree, a master's degree, a law degree, a PhD. We can get any professional license for any job we want. We can go into black neighborhoods and teach black children, knowing nothing about them, their families, or their communities. Thinking that because we got 5 weeks of training with Teach for America, that we know what the hell we're talking about. Never been up in their space, never actually know anything about them, but just show up because we care. See, that's not how the real world works. That ignorance should mark us as incompetent, but it doesn't. And it's not just with regard to policing, it's with regard to a lot of other things, right? So I was thinking about this recently, about a year and a half ago. I was driving our daughters. I have 2 daughters. My wife and I have 2 daughters. They're 14 and 12 now. But about a year and a half ago, when they were 12 and a half and 10 and a half, I was driving them from school to dance. They're dancers. And at the time, they were dancing at the same studio, which was downtown, about, 8-10 minutes away from their school. And so I picked them up, and I'm driving the distance between the school and the studio. And at one point, you have to go through a public housing development to get to the studio, right? So we're at the stoplight, waiting for it to turn green, surrounded by public housing on both sides. And the 10-and-a-half-year-old, whose name is Rachel, takes this opportunity to ask me a question. She says, "Daddy, why is it that pretty much everybody in this neighborhood is black?" Right? Which is a really damn good question. Like, that is an excellent observation on her part. It's a very interesting sociological inquiry and anthropological inquiry. And my guess is that that wasn't the first day she'd noticed that the neighborhood was pretty much all black. It was just the first day she decided to ask, right? I'm sure she had noticed it. We've been driving that route for a year and a half at that point, so I'm sure that she had noticed it, but on that day, she decided to ask, and she probably asked because she figured Daddy might know, because Daddy talks about these things, so maybe he'll have the answer. Like, if I was an accountant, she wouldn't have asked me. She would have just been like, "How do I do my taxes?" And I would have been like, online. I don't know. You know. But so she asked the question. Now, here's the thing. She asked me, why is pretty much everyone in this neighborhood black? And, of course, her sister, who's 12 and a half, wanting to show up her younger sister and impress her father, naturally decided to intervene with the wisdom that she had apparently obtained somewhere, don't know where. So the 12 and a half-year-old jumps in and says, redlining! And this is strangely accurate. And for those of you who don't know what redlining means, because I know not everybody does, I will explain. Redlining is, in fact, part of the answer to the question that her sister asked. Redlining was a practice that was very formal for generations, right, where banks would basically draw on a map in their office red lines around black neighborhoods. And essentially anybody that lived within the boundaries of that neighborhood, didn't matter what their personal credit history was, didn't matter what their income was, didn't matter what their occupational status was, didn't matter who they were. All that mattered was you live in this neighborhood, you ain't getting a loan, right? And that's how black and brown communities were starved of wealth and starved of resources. And so when the 12-and-a-half-year-old butts in and says, redlining, she's not wrong, although it was weird. And the 10-and-a-half-year-old then says, yeah, I don't know what that means. And I said, yeah, neither does your sister. She's just showing off. She probably heard me say that at some point, and she was partially right. So then I proceeded to spend the next 2.5 or 3 minutes sort of giving her a real brief history lesson, right, about the way that certain people were allowed to live in various neighborhoods and other people were not. Public housing, as it turns out, was created in the 1930s for poor white people, right? Black folks weren't even allowed in public housing in most cases. Poor Latino folks, they weren't allowed in public housing. It was set up for poor white folks. But roughly at the same time, the government also started to do some other things, which very quickly allowed white folks to move out of public housing, right? So we created the FHA loan program, the VA loan program, the GI Bill later on, maybe 10, 15 years later, and that allowed white folks almost exclusively to hustle it out to the suburbs where only we were allowed to live, keeping those who weren't allowed to live there in the cities. Now you had white folks able to leave for greener pastures, black folks still trapped in urban areas in public housing. It wasn't an accident. It was the result of deliberate decisions to prefer white people and to give us a leg up and to denigrate black people because, again, historically, systemically, black lives did not matter. Right? And so I tell my daughter this, and it's like a 3-minute lesson. It's not like a big, huge discourse. You know, it's 3 minutes, and she's like, oh, okay, now I understand. But the important thing I want you to understand about that story is, what if I don't know the answer? And I would gather that a lot of families don't, particularly a lot of white parents, wouldn't know the answer to that question. Again, this is what I do, so I know the answer, right? But a lot of folks wouldn't know because they were never taught. So I actually asked a group of parents about 2 weeks later, what would you have said if your kid had asked that? And they were all like, I don't know. I don't know that I knew the answer, and maybe I would have changed the subject. See, there's a problem, right? Because if we don't know the answer and our children are thinking that, and not just the white kids, by the way, kids of color too, we're starting to wonder, why is this neighborhood all black and brown? Why is this poor neighborhood in particular all black and brown? If I'm a black kid, I'm wondering that. If I'm a white kid, I'm wondering that. And you know what? If I don't know the answer, do you think my child isn't going to fill in the blanks herself? Oh no, she's going to fill in the blanks. And do you know what she's going to fill in the blank with? She's going to fill it in with the default position of this culture. What do you think the default position is in this society? What is our creation myth? What is our secular gospel? You know it as well as I. Everybody raised here or who was born and has lived here for any particular amount of time knows the answer. The secular gospel is what? That idea that, well, wherever you end up in life, it's all about you. You can make it if you just try hard enough, right? That notion of rugged individualism and meritocracy, right? Which history proves is a lie. But if I don't know history, my kid defaults to that because that's what she's hearing. She's hearing that wherever you end up, it's all about you. So if you made it out of the hood, it's because you must have had a better work ethic or better DNA or whatever, a stronger family. And if you're still trapped there, there's something wrong with you. Obviously, you're inferior in some way, culturally, biologically, in terms of family structure. That's the default position. The fact that it's not true doesn't matter. The fact that we all know it's more complicated than that. We all know people, don't we, who worked hard their whole life, have nothing to show for it. We also know people who were born on third base, think they hit a triple, and haven't actually had to work hard at all in their lives. We all know that it's more complicated, but children don't know how to process that. So if they ask that question and we don't know the history, they're going to assume the reason these people are over here and we're all over here is because we're better. And they're worse. So in other words, you see the pernicious element of this. Racism gets reinforced just by the normal workings of the society. It doesn't require anyone to actually sit you down and teach you racism. It doesn't require someone to sit you down and say, these people are better and these people are inferior. All you have to do is just look around, see the inequality, and have no answer for why. And the only answer you're given is the one that rationalizes it, rugged individualism. Just as a side note, there is no such thing as a rugged individual, right? In fact, I would argue there's no such thing as an individual. What the hell is an individual? Human beings have always lived in a social context, right? If you ever meet someone who's really a rugged individual, you need to run from that person. Because seriously, that person would be dangerous as hell. They would be like a feral dog, right? A rugged individual would be somebody who was raised on an island by a porpoise, right? They would have no language. They would just try to eat you because they wouldn't even know that that was wrong, like, right? Like, we're all social beings. So the idea that I did everything on my own, nobody did anything on their own, right? Nobody did anything. If I had been born and then just like left out on my own, you think I'd be giving this talk? I wouldn't be giving any talk. I wouldn't know how to talk. I would just grunt, right? Nobody did anything on their own. There's no self-made millionaires. There's no self-made billionaires. Certainly somebody that inherited $200 million from his daddy and wants to be president is not a self-made anything. A man whose father actually made his fortune shaking down poor people in public and government-subsidized housing, I should point out as well. Right? But see, we don't know the history, and this is immigration too. The same thing is true with immigration. If you don't understand history, that's why we get all twisted up about immigration. That's why we go off on Latino folk coming over that border. Only that border though, right? Because we only get twisted about that border. Nobody's freaking out about Canada. The Minutemen don't sit off the coast of Nova Scotia with guns, trying to take shots at those sneaky Canadians coming into this country to take advantage of our superior healthcare system. Because that would be crazy, right? We only worry about that border. I should point out, it's an artificial border that was created as the result of a war of aggression that this country started on the basis of a lie. And then we took half their country, and now folks are coming home, and we don't understand why. Coming home. You do understand, I hope, that Latino folk were on this continent and in what we now call the United States long before we were. Right? They're a mixture of indigenous peoples and European peoples. Far before most of our families got here, they were here. Right? But we kick them out, and then we change the locks and tell them they can't come home, and we call that justice. The only reason we're able to do that is because we don't know our history. So think about it. We say things like this. Well, I don't mind if they come. I just want them to come the right way. Legally, like my ancestors. The hell? Legally? Like your ancestors? Look, here's the deal. When our great whatevers came here, there was no law to break. Right? So the fact that our ancestors didn't break a law that didn't even exist doesn't get us brownie points, cookies, or pats on the back. It says nothing about our ethics. It doesn't make us better because we came legally. There was no law. Maybe indigenous people wish they'd passed one, right? Maybe they wish they'd had a better regime of immigration control, but they didn't, and now we act like somehow we're morally superior because we came with papers. No, you didn't. You just didn't have to, right? Or we say things like, and this is why I think we can't see ourselves in immigrants from Mexico or Central or South America, right, is because we've convinced ourselves that they're coming for different reasons than we did, right? So people of European descent, I mean, African folk know how they got here. Indigenous folk know how they got here, right? A lot of Asian folk know they were brought to work on the railroads. They know how they got here, right? But we as European descended peoples, we act like we have this fictive narrative that says, oh, well, our ancestors came for principles like liberty and freedom. But those people, they're just coming for stuff, right? They're coming to take advantage. We came because we're these high-minded, principle-seeking freedom lovers, right? Donald Trump says, you know, Mexico, they're not sending their best. What, you think Europe sent their best? The hell? Like, you think the best of Europe left Europe? If they were winning in Europe, why the hell would they get on the boat? Let's just be honest. Like, our ancestors were the losers of their respective societies. We act like they weren't. Oh, they came for high-minded principle. No, they didn't. They came for stuff. They came for land, and they came for opportunity. They came for the ability to feed their children so they wouldn't starve. They were starving. They couldn't make it, as James Baldwin said. Some of them were convicts, right? Sold into indentured servitude on behalf of richer people who kept them in virtual slavery. That's who we were. We were the losers of Europe, and there's no shame in that, but we got to own it, because if we're not willing to own it, we put ourselves above Mexican folk. Right? We were the losers. The winners didn't get on the boat. I'm not trying to be mean. I'm not trying to be mean, not trying to be judgmental, but the winners did not leave. If you were kicking ass in Europe, why would you leave? It's like we somehow believe that like mid-1600s, this conversation happened. Just imagine, if you will, the following scene. There is a father in about 1650 who gathers his family around the fireplace and says the following. All right, now, I know that on the one hand, things are going incredibly well. I mean, we have got this big house, this mansion. We've got all this gold out back. You remember last Friday, children, when the king invited us to his palace and you played with his children out in the garden? I know, it was brilliant, wasn't it? I know. It was great, right? It was fantastic. However, Daddy has an idea. So in spite of the fact that like we're doing really well, right, I think that what would be fabulous for this summer is we are going to give all that up, leave it all behind, just gather up a few things, what you can carry in your own two hands, or a knapsack, or whatever we have in the 1600s that's like a knapsack, and we are going to get on a boat, a rickety old ship. I don't even know if it's seaworthy. Like, honestly, it might sink. We might be eaten by sharks. We might get scurvy or be hijacked by pirates who take everything that we have. But, children, I think you will agree with Father, it will be an adventure. Okay, that shit did not happen. That did not happen. Only the losers left because the losers had nothing else to lose. And here's the thing. If we would just own that, if we would just acknowledge that, then we could see us in them and we could see they in us. We could understand the connectivity we have with those recent immigrants who were coming to this country. But if we continue to suggest that we came for principle and they're only coming to take advantage of stuff, then we can never see ourselves in the other. And that's why we end up in this place. That's why we end up with a candidate who says he wants to build a wall. But not just any wall. A wall like you wouldn't believe. Whatever the hell that means. What is a wall that I wouldn't believe? Like, everything he does is going to be like you wouldn't believe. I'm going to support veterans like you wouldn't believe. I'm going to bomb ISIS like you wouldn't believe. I'm going to do everything like, what is a wall that I wouldn't, like the only wall that I wouldn't believe is like a butter wall. Is that what he means? A big, beautiful butter wall? Because I don't believe that'll work. I think that'll probably melt in the southwestern sun. So, you know, but he says things like, who can build walls better than Trump? I don't know. Anybody? Like, Trump has never built a wall. He builds casinos and hotels and tacky office buildings. And actually, let's be real honest, he doesn't build anything. He gets brown people to do that, half of whom are undocumented. So there's that. But the only reason we're even in this moment is because of the way that we have misunderstood history. See, historical memory matters. It's not just that the past itself matters and brings us to this point, though it does. It's also that the way we remember it matters. So the past that I was talking to my daughter about is why it is that the typical white family in America has 15 times the net worth of the typical black family, 11 or 12 times that of the typical Latino family, because certain people were able to accumulate stuff when other people were not. It's why right now black households headed by a college graduate have half the net worth on average compared to white households headed by a high school dropout. Let me repeat. White households headed by a dropout have twice the net worth on average of black households headed by a college grad. $52,000 on average for the white household, $26,000 for the black household in spite of greater education levels, greater qualifications, probably even higher income. Why? Because in past generations, some people could accumulate and others weren't, and then you pass down those advantages generation after generation. So the past matters, but it's not just the past, it's how we remember it or choose not to. Historical memory is every bit as important as history itself. And at this point, as a country, we haven't gotten clear enough on that, and that's why we continue to have all of these conflicts. If we would have an honest discussion about the weight of history and how we got to this point, we could do something about it. We have to do something about it. But by the way, not out of some sense of guilt. And I want to close with this before I take questions, because this is not at all about guilt. No one in this room is guilty of the system that you inherited, but you inherited it nonetheless. There's a difference between guilt and responsibility, right? Guilt is what you feel for the stuff you actually did. Responsibility is something that you take because of the kind of person you are. And we take responsibility for things all the time that we're not technically to blame for, right? So think about environmental catastrophe and ecological crisis facing us not just as a country, but as a planet, right? None of you, I'm guessing, have your own personal stash of toxic waste that you inject into the water, the soil, or spew into the air via your own personal smokestack, right? And yet, we know that the air, the water, the soil has indeed been poisoned as a result of a number of industrial processes that, frankly, have brought our ecology to the brink of collapse. And so if we're being responsible, even though we didn't do it, we know we got to do something about it. And most responsible people understand that even though they're not guilty of the crime, they have to take responsibility for the solution. The same is true with this. And let me just tell you a story to illustrate what I mean, and then I'm done. And this story has nothing at all to do with race and racism, but it says something about those subjects that I think will be clear when I'm done. It's a story about something that happened when I got out of college. I graduated from Tulane University in New Orleans in 1990, so 26 years ago. And upon graduating, I thought that it would be a really great idea if I moved into a large house with 9 other people. Yeah. Let me just give you a little life advice in case you need this, in case you didn't already figure it out. And by the way, if you don't remember anything else I said tonight, for the love of God, you need to write this down. Do not think, even for one moment, that it is ever a good idea to live in a large house with 9 other people. If you can avoid it, do not do it. I know sometimes folks can't help it. You got to do what you got to do. But if you can avoid that, you need to try, because it is not going to be great. It is going to be, as it was for me, awful, right? I thought it was going to be great, though, because on the one hand, you know, when you get out of college, you're going to be broke, surprise, and we were. And so we thought, well, at the very least, if we got 10 people in a house, we'll save money. So on a financial level, it sort of made sense, right? Sort of a good idea. Rent was $525 a month. I don't mean per person, I mean total. All right. Yeah, even in 1990, that was pretty good, right? I'm not good at math, but you can do that one, right? $52.50 a month. That's it, man. You add all the utilities, the cable bill, we split the groceries, everything. It was like $100 a month. So on the financial level, this was a damn good idea. But I came to understand about 6 weeks in why it had been a terrible mistake. This is how I learned it. I was working downtown doing work against white supremacist former Klan leader David Duke when he was running for the U.S. Senate, and came back uptown one afternoon, and I got off the streetcar and I walked into the neighborhood, and I walked up the stairs at 1805 Robert Street, and I opened the door, right, and I was met by this incredible smell. And I mean that in a good way, which, you know, when you live with 9 other people, there are a lot of smells, most of them not great. This one, actually good. It was the smell of dinner being made for the whole family, quote unquote, the whole house. On the left front burner of the stove, one of my roommates was making a big pot of gumbo, right? Because it's New Orleans and that's what you do. And man, it looked good and it smelled good. It even had some shrimp in there. Not many. Like I said, we were broke, but it had like 3. Had like 3 of those really little bitty ass shrimp, those tiny shrimp, right? Look like, you know, they make regular shrimp look like jumbo shrimp. They make jumbo shrimp look like lobsters, that kind of shrimp, you know, right? You know, and man, it looked good and it smelled good. But when the roommate asked me if I wanted any, I actually said no, because As it turned out, I'd already had dinner downtown. I didn't know he was making gumbo. If I'd known, I would have waited, but I didn't, and so I hadn't. And so when he asked me if I wanted some, I said, man, I'd love it, but I've already eaten. So do me a favor, take some of that, put it in a plastic container, put it in the fridge. I'll take it to work tomorrow because it looks great. He said, cool, I'll do that. And I said, great. And I went upstairs and I hung out with some of the roommates, watched TV, whatever it was we did for fun in 1990. There wasn't much, right? Social networking in 1990, just for those of y'all that don't remember it, is pretty much you just walk down to your roommate's room. You were like, what you doing? And they were like, nothing, fool. It's 1990, man. Nothing's going on. Like, why don't you go to sleep for about 15 years and then there'll be something. But right now, I got nothing for you. Go to bed. All right, so I went to bed sort of early, and I woke up the next morning at about, 7:30, something like that, 7 o'clock, to get ready for work, to come down and get some coffee. And I noticed when I came down to get my coffee that on the left front burner of that stove was still the pot of gumbo, right? It didn't look as good as it had the night before. And it definitely didn't smell as good as it had the night before. And he hadn't saved any of it. He hadn't cleaned up the pot. I mean, it was just nasty, getting crusted and disgusting on the side of the pot. And I was sort of angry, but, I thought maybe I should wake him up and, tell him how angry I am. But then I'm like, forget it, man. You know what? I'll take it up with him later. For now, I'm just going to clean it, So I grabbed the pot of gumbo, and I bring it over to the sink, and I grab the scrub brush and, the soap, and I'm getting ready to clean this thing out. And just as I start to run the water into the pot, I stop myself. I was like, man, what am I doing? I don't have to do this. I didn't make this mess. Hell, I didn't even eat any of this mess. I don't have to do this. Now I felt really self-righteous because I'm talking myself out of doing the hard work, right? Which is a skill I learned in college, by the way. So I decide, forget it, man. I'm going to put this pot of gumbo right back where I found it. So I put it back on the left front burner of the stove, basically saying he can clean it. When he gets up, he'll do it. I'll see him tonight. So I walk out the door, not having done the work. I go to work, come back that night about 6:30, walk in, notice that one of my other roommates is making dinner for the house that night on the right front burner of the stove. But on the left front burner is still this pot of gumbo. Now it is 24 hours old. It is smelling even worse. It is looking even worse. I look at my roommate who's cooking on the right front burner. I'm like, dude, you're making dinner for us on the right front burner. I'm pretty sure you can smell last night's dinner because it's right there. Why don't you clean that? And he's like, hey, man, I didn't make the gumbo. I didn't even have dinner here last night. I didn't eat any of the gumbo. And he pointed a accusing finger in my general direction, asked me if I'd had some. I said, no. He said, well, all right then. You want some lentils and rice? And I was like, yep. So I ate my lentils and rice. We both ignored the pot of nasty, stinking gumbo on the left front burner of the stove. I washed my plate off, put it in the dish rack to dry, went upstairs, hung out with the roommates, again, did whatever it is we did for fun in 1990, and went to bed. Woke up the next morning about 7 o'clock. I had forgotten to set an alarm. But here's a tip. If you're living in a house where a pot of gumbo has been sitting on the left front burner of your stove for 36 and a half hours, you're not going to need an alarm clock to wake your ass up. You will be awake because the smell is going to crawl out of the pot of gumbo. It's going to crawl out of the pot of gumbo on the legs that it grew overnight. And I don't mean that metaphorically. I mean literal legs with feet. And it is going to crawl across the kitchen, across the living room, up the back stairs, go down the back hall, under your door frame, and find with the precision of a laser that thing on the front of your face that you call a nose, and you will be awake. And now I was angry because I knew what the smell meant. I knew what was waiting for me on the left front burner of that stove, having not been cleaned by anybody, least of all the guy that made the mess. So I fling open my door. I start stomping down the hall, trying to wake up anybody, let them know how angry I am. I live with 9 other people, can't find one of them. And the guy that made the gumbo, right, he's like, where's Waldo? Nobody knows where in the hell he went. He just made the gumbo like a practical joke and disappeared. It's like he skipped town just to see how long it would take for somebody else to clean up his mess. I get down to the bottom of the stairs and I look across the living room into the kitchen. I see the gumbo. And I am confident to this day the gumbo saw me. Right? And it was in that moment, not one moment later, though not one moment earlier, that I came to understand the most important lesson I'd ever learned about any subject, any time, before or since, in or out of a classroom. Not just about household cleanliness, but any topic. What was the lesson? The lesson was this. Didn't really matter anymore, did it? Whether I was the one who had made the mess. Didn't really matter anymore whether I was, as the saying goes, the author of all this unpleasantness. The only thing that mattered was I was tired of living in the funk, in the residue of somebody else's actions, right? And the same is true with human society. When we get tired of living with the residue of what other people did, with or without our approval, we'll get busy cleaning it up, not because we're to blame, but because we're the only ones left to do the job. Thank you all so much for being here. I appreciate you.
Now, I know many whites are always not very comfortable discussing the topics as has been enumerated by Tim Wise there. And I think he is somebody who has always devoted himself towards educating the masses over the issue of racism. You know, many times we see blacks talk about the challenges they face within American society. We see how they have been disenfranchised, yet nobody is always there to really acknowledge the kind of challenges these people have gone through. Look at the level of disparities in almost every sector in life. For example, look at health. Health, we have a lot of health disparities relating to how blacks are highly likely to face challenges, especially when it comes to lifestyle diseases. We also have a lot of challenges when it comes to education. Whites are more educated than blacks because they have better access to good school infrastructure and everything that comes with it. When you look at employment and even income levels, we are told that a white family owns almost 10 times as much wealth as that a black family can hold. And therefore, there are a lot of things that always go against black people in America. That is why many times I try to really listen to some of the teachings like that of Tim Wise to really get to educate myself on the intricacies of racism and how it can be sorted or addressed within the American society. Now, even as we listen to Tim Wise, one question that we ask ourselves, is it really necessary to continue having anti-racism activism within America? There are those who always support this, but others think that this is not necessary. What does research say about this? Anti-racism activism remains critically necessary in American society for several compelling reasons, reflecting both historical legacies and contemporary challenges. First of all is the historical context. The United States has a deep-rooted history of racial discrimination, from slavery and segregation to systemic disenfranchisement. Despite legal strides like the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the echoes of these practices persist in modern institutions. The legacy of these systems has created a foundation where racial disparities are baked into social, economic, and political structures. Anti-racism activism works to dismantle these inherent inequalities, striving for a society that genuinely reflects equality promised by American ideals. So, from the historical perspective, we know that a lot of systems that control and govern America have their foundation laced with racial disenfranchisement. And therefore, it is quite necessary for anti-racism activism to persist, because without this, changes will not be realized as it is required. Persistent racial disparity. Today, racial disparities are evident across various metrics of well-being and opportunity. For instance, there are significant gaps in education where schools in predominantly black and brown neighborhoods often lack resources. Health outcomes show black Americans and Native Americans have higher rates of chronic illnesses and lower life expectancies compared to white counterparts. In the criminal justice system, there is a disproportionate incarceration rate among black and Hispanic populations. Economically, wealth gaps continue to widen with systemic barriers to home ownership and business development for minorities. Anti-racism activism addresses these inequalities by advocating for policy changes, community empowerment, and cultural shifts towards equality. So if you look at the persistent racial disparity that exists in America, it touches almost every aspect of human life. And therefore, for blacks to ever have a fair shot at life, they must continue with anti-racism activism. And that is why people like Tim Wise are making good contributions towards ensuring that blacks in America have a safe and better America that they can live in and be proud of. Implicit bias and cultural norms. Even with overt racism decreasing, implicit biases and microaggressions subtly undermine racial equality. These biases influence decision-making in hiring, policing, medical treatment, and judicial outcomes. Anti-racism education helps individuals recognize and mitigate these hidden prejudices. Activism also challenges cultural norms that perpetuate stereotypes or marginalize certain groups, promoting a culture where diversity is not just tolerated but celebrated. Political and social backlash. Recent years have seen a resurgence of explicit racial tensions with increasing hate crimes and political movements that often advocate for policies that could roll back civil rights gains. Anti-racism activism counters this backlash by organizing, educating, and mobilizing communities to resist regressive policies and to push for progressive ones that ensure protection and rights for all. Youth and future generations. The activism of today shapes the attitudes and policies that will govern future generations. Educating young people about racial justice not only equips them to navigate a diverse world, but also to lead it towards more equitable outcomes. Youth-led movements like Black Lives Matter have shown how younger voices can drive significant social change. As such, anti-racism activism in America is not just about correcting past wrongs, but about actively shaping a society that lives up to the democratic principles. It is an ongoing dynamic process that involves education, policy advocacy, community organizing, and cultural transformations to ensure that all individuals, regardless of race, can thrive equally. I think this is all we need in America and every society that we have across the world. That is why I continue applauding Tim Wise for his commitment to educating American masses about the implicit biases that exist against Black people and how Blacks have continued to suffer without anybody noticing or even paying attention to why they need to be helped. Tell me down in the comment section what you think about this. And if you're watching us for the first time, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, like this video, and also share. Thank you, and may the good Lord bless you. Goodbye.